Listos.
Gracias. Buenos días. Bienvenidos.
Thank you. Good morning and welcome. Everyone, it's an honor to be guests sessions. This is being organized by the INE and the School of and what could be the most 45 million voters. In democracy, we're talking about one of the largest democracies in the world, actually the largest with a big divide. We're not only seeing this in the US, but we're also seeing this divide in other parts of the world. Bipartisanism, which clearly is very different from what we have in our electoral systems in Latin America. But I believe that we can all identify new challenges for electoral authorities in our countries, especially in Mexico. Lessons learned and electoral rules that we need to start to change. As a Mexican electoral authority, I shouldn't be saying this, but I believe it's still a good idea to always be in touch with all the rest of the democracies in the world, electoral systems, and to go back to these old and new rules and best practices that allow us to perfect our systems. So I want to thank each and all of you for your presence, as well as all the attendees that are here online. And I would like to start by giving the floor to Dr. Raul Contreras Bustamante, the director of the School of Law of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, so he can welcome us. Thank you, Dr. Contreras. Thank you, Councillor Humphrey. Good morning to each and all of you. Thank you for watching us live. We're broadcasting through the YouTube channel of the School of Law and the social media of INE. It's a real honor. It's a real honor for the National Electoral Institute and the School of Law to have this second seminar today. Actually, we're having this second conversation, which is part of a series entitled Democracy and Elections All Over the World. It's a real pleasure to have today Laura Chinchill, former president of Costa Rica and president of the Commission of Elections and Democracy of the Digital Age of the Kofi Annan Foundation. We also have Jorge Castaneda, who is a dear friend of this school. And of course, we have our great friend, Emilio Rabasa, who is a great researcher and professor. And we also have Larry Diamond, a researcher from Stanford. This seminar is an analysis. It's a comparative law exercise that has been organized together by the INE and the School of Law. We designed it so that we could conduct a comparative analysis, as Mrs. Humphries just said, so that we can obtain or analyze the best practices that can be of help for our countries based on what has happened in other countries, considering upcoming elections in Mexico in the first week of June next year. This, of course, means that we need to do this type of exercises because the 2021 election in Mexico will be the most complicated ever organized by the National Electoral Institute, or INE. And we're trying to be watchful of what's happening in the US. In one first segment in this seminar, we had interesting conversations. The truth is that we're not only interested in what's happening in the US, considering the electoral process, but we're also conducting an analysis on presidentialism. Presidentialism, which is an institution that has always been interesting. The US has always shown the world what it is like, and it has been of influence to other countries, including our country. But today, we're kind of questioning and testing this system, presidentialism. We'll try to figure out what's happening because right now in the US, we have the president himself complaining or contesting the validity of elections before they took place. He's even accusing institutions of the federal government, such as those bodies in charge of the Postal Service. I mean, he was campaigning even from the White House. We also found that the traditional allies of the US, like Israel, like the UK, France, Germany, Saudi Arabia, and Spain, have already congratulated Joe Biden. And nevertheless, Mr. Trump continues to say that there are surprises under his sleeve. I mean, we have an electoral system that is kind of stagnant. It is still conceived as an outdated system, a system that is out of fashion, that still tries to control predominantly a white hegemony, but they haven't considered achievements in the field of human rights that conceive voting as a human right. So we'll be attentive to what happens on December 14 when electors have to vote, when they can even change the mandate of the vote legally and vote freely. And we'll try to figure out what the result of this polarization or divide is. I believe that by way of conclusion, maybe after we finish this analysis about the US, we may conclude that it's time for a new amendment to the US Constitution that finally addresses all these problems that the electoral system has in that country, because it's not working. Because to be honest, the big US democracy hasn't been able to address or solve this electoral issue in the democratic conditions we expected. I don't want to say any more during this intervention, but once again, I want to welcome you all, including, of course, our panelists. And also, I want to thank Mr. Cordova for the INE's support for the organization of this seminar. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Contreras. Thank you very much for your welcoming words. And thank you for this introduction to the topic at hand, the topic we will address in this seminar. And next, I would like to invite Lorenzo Cordova, the president of INE, to speak. Thank you very much, dear Councilor Carla Humphrey. I want to greet the director of the School of Law of the National University, Mr. Contreras. And of course, I want to say hi to our guests who are incredible characters that have the capacity to analyze this particular moment. This expectation arisen by the latest elections in the U.S. Is unprecedented, at least considering what has happened in this century. There was a lot of interest among specialists, markets, and even ordinary citizens, which we hadn't seen with Brexit or with the U.S. election held 4 years ago, or the elections that tried to institute the democratic regime having to do with the Arab Spring. Furthermore, what happened recently in the U.S. in terms of the abundant participation of voters and the democratic responsibility that the media have used, and the tight victory in some states are some of the elements that are encouraging people and experts to reflect on the operation of electoral systems, including the U.S. system. But in general terms, electoral systems globally, as well as their operation in the context of a pandemic and amid this divide, social divide. Of course, my purpose here is not to make a thorough reflection about these topics. That's why we have our distinguished guests. What I would like to do is put on the table just some elements that could contribute to our reflection, or maybe be thought-provoking for the panelists participating in this second session of this seminar. Which is an event organized by the National Autonomous University's School of Law and our institute. So let me put on the table the following points that are obvious for scholars of democracy and that come from one of the oldest and most consolidated democracies in the world. Number one, in times of pandemic, it's necessary for electoral authorities to be sensitive so that they can take the preventive measures that allow society to exercise their political rights without health risks. This sensitivity may involve the possibility of early voting, open spaces to vote, or outdoor polling stations, more polling stations, and health measures which are becoming everyday measures like using a face mask, gloves, and keeping safe distance. Number two, the application of local rules to tally national or federal votes does not seem to be contributing to the certainty of national elections, especially when there are so tight differences in these electoral victories. That means that the system must be robust enough to give certainty in moments of tension, and recent elections show that this can happen over and over in democracies that are competitive. Also, these elections showed clearly the importance of independence of electoral bodies. A few weeks ago, Dr. Diamond published an article on New York Times, which is worth reading, talking about this issue, as well as the importance of the role of the media in terms of supporting democracy. If this dependence hadn't been there in these elections, eventually U.S. democracy would be going through a very difficult time. I want to conclude by saying that for those who are advocates of democratic systems and are committed to their consolidation, it is clear that there are no recipes for the design of electoral systems. There are no single recipes, and the context of each nation and their history will make a difference, which must be taken into account. Furthermore, the experiences of technical international cooperation have shown us that democracies can be enriched through transparent and clear processes, but their strengthening depends on the attitude of political actors, the respect, and their abiding by the rules of the game. I believe that this is the biggest lesson in this analysis in the last decades. Democracies are recreated with institutions, but also with Democrats. From there, that the best way to address the problems of democracy, as is typically said, should involve the tools of democracy itself. From there, that I believe that in order to overcome the pandemic, we need to reinforce the mechanisms of control of power and protect fundamental rights and ensure that the cycle of powers obtained democratically is maintained in the ballot boxes and in the polling stations. Thank you, Laura, Larry, Jorge, and Emilio. Thank you for participating. Thank you, Carla, for allowing us to participate here in this session. Thank you, President. I would like, before I start this panel, I would like to say the following. We have Dr. Alanis, who just connected. She's apologizing. She was here from the beginning, but she didn't have access to voice or video. But I'm glad to have Dr. Alanis here. Let me just tell you that we have biographical information of our panelists. They have been circulated and emailed to each and all of you. We won't read their bios. Each of them will have 15 minutes to participate. And after their intervention, I'm sure we'll have questions by the audience. We'll try to get them organized so that they can answer your questions. Without further ado, and to start this important event, and to be able to listen to everything they have to say, I want to give the floor to Laura Chinchill, former president of Costa Rica. Please, former president, it will be an honor to listen to you. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning to each and all of you, especially the participants. It's a real pleasure to be here also with these distinguished panel members, people I love and people I care about. I want to thank especially Lorenzo and Raul for the invitation to participate here. My intention here today is not to teach anything to anyone, especially because I have a lot of experts. I want to get into a very detailed analysis of the U.S. Electoral system. However, I believe it is worth highlighting some aspects from a personal standpoint and then from a general standpoint. Personally, I had an opportunity 4 years ago of heading the first electoral observation mission that took place in the U.S. From the OAS, on behalf of the OAS, which allowed me to learn a little about this system, their system. And number two, I would like to say that I feel that even though the electoral system in the U.S. has a high level of exceptionality, especially compared to Latin American systems, there are some important thoughts or reflections, common reflections that have to do a lot with many of the concerns in our own democracies that I believe that we should consider. My presentation, which is limited to 15 minutes, basically is based on a premise with three caveats that I believe are in order. And then I'll talk about some particular traits of the U.S. electoral system vis-a-vis the main characteristics of ours. And finally, I will do an assessment of some of the aspects that have been on the spotlight and that should be reviewed. But also, I would like to point out some strengths and then some conclusions. The basic premise that may be obvious, but is always important to stress, is that electoral systems do not operate in a vacuum. I mean, they are conditioned by different factors, including the way the political system is organized, where we have one first major difference between the federalist system in the U.S., which is deeply decentralized, for example, if compared to other federal systems like the Brazilian or the Mexican system or Argentina in our continent. We have abysmal differences, but what prevails in our countries are centralized system, which is not their case. Then we have the institutional setting, which is key. When I talk about institutional setting, I'm talking about the democratic institutional setting. And by that, I refer to the robustness in terms of personal freedoms, the freedom of speech, balance of power, and the issue of the rule of law, which condition the operation of electoral systems. And the third aspect I would like to mention that conditions an electoral system has to do with the civic and political culture in a country. In this regard, I believe that we're becoming more similar between contexts, which are increasingly characterized by huge divide in the population, with higher levels of intolerance and bigotry, which is closely linked to the global phenomenon of the deterioration of citizens' trust in democratic institutions. Based on these premises, that forces or lead us to analyze the characteristics of the electoral systems, I believe that there are three things I must highlight. Number one, we can never say that the one electoral system is better than another. At the end of the day, that system is the result of a series of variables, but there is a key ingredient, a really important ingredient. I'm talking about the citizens' trust in their electoral system. And that trust tends to be one of the most successful factors when it comes to the operation of that system. So rather than talking about better or worse system, we can find good or bad practices to share. And in that regard, we want to be very cautious when it comes to judging with our own parameters electoral systems of other countries. This is something I lived in that first exercise, in that first mission where I participated in the US. We were there to evaluate the US electoral system, and that mission was made up of Latin American people. But we found that we could not just extrapolate based on the perspective of our institutional background and our institutions these criteria to analyze the behavior, the characteristics of the electoral system in the US. And the third thing I want to highlight is that beyond the problems that have to do with the electoral system, which are being discussed today, we need to remember that the US is a country that has experienced 46 transitions in power so far in a very peaceful manner. Mexico has only done it 4 times. My country, which is one of the most solid democracies, has not only had 22 transitions. So we're talking about the system that beyond its problems has shown to be very resilient. Now, let me talk about some of the particularities that we can stress or highlight when it comes to the US system compared against Latin American systems. I mean, popular vote is not used to appoint the president. Popular votes are not what they use to appoint the president. You have a series of representatives that are members of the Electoral College. They make the decision on who to elect depending on the number of votes in their states. And as a result of that, which may not be understandable for Latin Americans, whoever wins the popular vote doesn't always win elections. In this case, Biden is winning by more than 5 million electoral votes in difference as a difference, but not by a huge margin when it comes to college or electoral college votes. In our systems, we do not have a jurisdiction that is specialized. I mean, we have ordinary tribunals, and they are the ones addressing with all contested matters regarding the electoral system. So since we do not have a central authority, because they have a really decentralized system, I believe that there is no other system like that in the world. And I say this because each state administers their own process. And some states delegate that authority to the different counties. And that's where we find the following. The first time we looked into the window of the US electoral system from a Latin American perspective, we found it chaotic and anarchic. Why? Because we always find a series of different rules when it comes to voting. We find different regulations for registration of voters, etc. So, and also, we don't have, and this is the end of my comparison, we do not have a national document, a national ID, and therefore there is not a single electoral roll in the US, which tends to frighten the Latin American people when we discuss the risk of having a double of triple voting. What are some of the most controversial aspects that we highlighted in a report 4 years ago on behalf of the OAS, which have been considered in the debate in the US, the rule of representativeness and the majorities, basically focusing on the discussion of the validity or not of the Electoral College, at least in the way it is conceived today. And also linked to the issue of representativeness, we have the composition of the Senate and how, in effect, they have acquired disproportionate power, including minorities, especially in rural states, whose inhabitants lean increasingly towards the Republican Party, which means that a state like California with 40 million inhabitants has the same number of senators compared to a state like Wyoming, which only 600,000 inhabitants. This also weakens the representation of ethnic minorities and racial minorities, which tend to concentrate more in the most populated states. And these mechanisms tend to become a lack of incentive to encourage voting, which is the ultimate objective of any electoral system. Any electoral system should have the mission beyond the transfer of integrity. They should have the mission of increasingly expanding the right to voting by eliminating these barriers that prevent people from voting. The other topic that has been controversial is the issue of this hyper-decentralization, which of course has some benefits. I'll come back to them, but that shouldn't necessarily mean the absence of standards in minimum processes, at least when it comes to requirements for registration, and when it comes to being able to consolidate a single electoral roll that allows for a better control in each state. The other topic or the other issue that is controversial when it comes to their system is this district delimitation that has been becoming more politicized as a result of the incentive of this rule, not of the majorities, of giving a privilege to minorities. And the issue of funding is another important aspect, which in my opinion is not only the weakest link in the US electoral system. I mean, financing or funding, it has no limits. They promote anonymity and conflicts of interest. This is based on a series of amendments or resolutions from the Supreme Court of Justice that have been using the First Amendment to justify the right to spend. They believe that that is a form of freedom of speech, and therefore that spending is not subject to any sort of controls. And obviously we have all this deal about information and social media, and in this regard we're becoming more similar between our different societies. I believe that the external interference factor is being left behind. The greatest enemies when it comes to the responsible use of social media are Americans themselves. We're talking about the system that they want to regulate the use of social media. We're also talking about large companies that were to some extent more regulated this time, but still they can interfere with information. This is something I have studied, but I'll come back to that point. Just to wrap up, talking about some of the strengths of EU systems, I want to say the following. When it comes to strengths vis-a-vis Latin American systems, I would like to highlight the strength that historically has existed in the US in terms of participation and of voters and civic culture and respect for the rules. In the US, we'll have this common saying that we have in Latin America, in the say that once you have a rule, you also have a way of a loophole. That's how they can organize elections without such a centralized and vertical systems like the ones we have in our countries. In other words, our systems are based on the element of distrust. In the US, they have been evolving on the basis of trust. Political parties are strong, civil society is organized, and there are many checks and balances that truly allow them to generate minimum risks when it comes to electoral fraud as part of their electoral system. In our countries, I mean, is just enough for an autocratic government or a government with few democratic traits to co-opt electoral systems for the system to vanish. So this hyper decentralization to some extent also has its benefits. And by this, I'm talking about the fact that it's difficult in their system, where, by the way, a lot of people participate with so many checks and balances can be the object of fraud. Another strength is the effective process of contesting decisions and the timely operation of justice. I mean, you can feel what we have called the rule of law when it comes to elections in the US. And finally, I would say that this is a process that is supplemented or complemented by an active and robust press. I mean, in the opinion of some people, they are biased from a partisan standpoint. But in any event, that is better than what we have in our countries, where the press and the media claim that they are neutral, even though they bias in favor of some candidates. I would conclude by saying that the US elections are part of a series of elections that in recent years have taught us important lessons. But this is the first time we see manifestations like this in the largest democracy in the world, and one of the most robust in the globe. Number one, the quality of leadership counts, and it counts greatly when it comes to electoral results, but also in terms of preserving the trust, the element of trust, which is essential in any electoral system. If that leadership undermines trust, it will be really difficult to attempt to retain citizens' trust in the system. I've seen it only twice in the US recently, and in Brazil, in the election I observed, where one of the candidates permanently was discrediting the other candidates, because one of the strengths of the Brazilian system was the trust of citizens in their electronic voting. And the second lesson is that the decision of electors counts, but sometimes the system can be very fragile depending on the institutional structure. Popular vote is becoming more fragile in the US, for example, and in other countries, electoral authorities cannot enforce those decisions. And another conclusion is that institutions are above everyone, and electoral systems will always survive as long as they have a robust institutional setting and structure. That's why the discussion about democracy in Latin America cannot only revolve around achievements in electoral matters, but we also have to talk about the freedom of the press and rule of law. And let me close by saying that no people are exempt from electing populist leaders, but not all peoples can correct those choices. But in the US, they could do it thanks to their institutional system, whereas in countries like Nicaragua or Venezuela, they were never able to make those decisions. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to former President Chinchill. Well, that was an extraordinary analysis. I believe that it is also based on the principles of the Kofi Annan Foundation, especially with this comparison between electoral systems in Latin America and their comparison with the US system. You talked about its strengths. I would like to emphasize the culture of legality or lawfulness. Even though rules can be enforced, they also have checks and balances, and of course, they have a strong civil society and a strong participation by the media. There are other democracies that need the different rules, which are created also based on our individual contexts. Our rules are based on the element of distrust, and that's why we need rules that ensure or guarantee legitimate results. And therefore, I believe that this first session with this comparison between the Latin American and the US systems is important. Next, we have our next panelist, Jorge Castaneda, former Foreign Minister of Mexico. And of course, he's also an expert when it comes to electoral matters and everything that has to do with the Mexican and the US systems. So welcome, Dr. Castaneda. Thank you, Carla. I want to thank you for your invitation, and also I want to thank Manuel for insisting on me being here, and because he made sure that I could be here. Carla is really generous. I'm not an expert in electoral matters, especially in the US. I need to say, but my next comments are taken from a book I just published, which was also published in Spanish, America Through Foreign Eyes, where I try to show, based on what U.S. experts have said, how we have arrived to a dysfunctional democracy in the U.S., partially thanks to the electoral system, but also based on other considerations that have to some extent paralyzed or prevented us from making significant reforms in the US, both in the legal, juridical, and prison spheres, and even the migratory system, even though the public opinion clearly supports these changes, which has been measured via surveys. So these reflections are inspired on what I have written in this chapter of the book. The first thing that comes to my mind is that if these loopholes in the US system, which had not been tested or questioned, due to the fact that except for 2000, nobody had really contested results, electoral results. I mean, it happened in one state in an election, but now we're talking about the 8 and 9 states where they are contesting results, which are promoted by Trump. And this is expanding to other states. This has resulted in all sorts of challenges, ranging from absurd ones to very serious matters, like the ones we may see, for example, on December the 14th. It's an absurdity. I mean, since you do not have a national electoral body, as President Chinchill just mentioned it, or Lorenzo mentioned, they don't have an INE like in Mexico, you always have this complication, because you know who will have the final say when it comes to the winning party or a candidate. They have the involvement of, they will have some involvement of the Chamber of Representatives in January, but since 1952, it has been a de facto procedure through the different consortiums that do forecasts or projections for TV networks, which are the ones that have the biggest influence. We have seen this process in countries like Mexico and Russia. The Mexican and Russian presidents have refused to congratulate Biden, claiming that there is not a final result yet, claiming that there is no electoral authority that has declared one won or not. Yes, to some extent, it is true. You have the Electoral College, which is what will happen on December 14, and then you have the TV networks that will determine or claim who has won 1 or 2 days after the election. This chain had never stopped working. even in problematic situations, the system was resilient, robust, and the system resisted all these complications like in Florida in 2000. But now we're in this difficult situation, which is not serious. I mean, neither Putin nor López Obrador will experience major consequences as a result of this challenge. But the loophole exists, or the gap exists. The one that is more complicated is the problem of the Electoral College and the rules that will apply at their meeting on December 14. Let me just share a couple of things that I believe that we all know, but that are worth highlighting. These elections, this recent election is the 7th of 8 recent elections where the Democratic candidate that won the popular vote. For practical purposes, it's almost impossible. I mean, we would need to see major changes that I don't see coming so that a Republican candidate can win the popular vote. This time, what we're seeing is that the difference may be as high as 7 million votes in difference between Biden and Trump, depending on the final tally in states like California, New York, and Illinois. I mean, 7 out of 8 in a baseball game would equate to the best hitter in history. And still, it's a high percentage. This is one first challenge for the system, for the US system. Number 2, something important also, which was confirmed in this election, is that despite some initial contradictory appearances, minority votes, that is, votes from African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic people, and originary or Native Americans accounted for a little more than 30% of voters, which is a significant amount, even though the level of participation of Hispanic or Latino people didn't increase that much. But in all these cases, the bias in favor of the Democratic candidate is to some extent outrageous when it comes to a normal, quote-unquote, electoral system. There are exceptions worldwide, but if we compare this, I mean, what has happened beginning in the 1960s versus what happened 100 years ago in the US when women were given the right to vote. When women entered the electoral arena, the vote of women was split 50-50. I mean, it was not very different from male voting, which is what we could expect normally. In the case of minorities, this time we saw once again more than 90% of electors, African American voters, voting for Biden, for example. More than 70% of Hispanic voters voted for Biden, and almost 80% voted for Biden among Asian Americans. In the case of Hispanic or Latino populations, there is a slight bias, which is the Cuban American voting process or effect in Miami. If we eliminated that, the percentage would be as high as 75%, 3-1 in favor of Biden. It's really difficult to have an electoral system where 1/3 of voters systematically are distributed with such a bias. This unavoidably will lead to problems. So let's now talk about the difficulties or the challenges. I know what will happen. Honestly, to be honest, I do not have an idea of the legal mechanisms that may determine what will happen on December 14. will have the electoral college gathering, and they will vote before December 14, depending on the state legislatures, state legislatures, the 50 state legislatures will gather to give a mandate to their legitimate representatives. The person with that mandate is not crucial because the numbers are determined by the mechanism mentioned by President Chinchill, which we all know. What is not clear yet is how they should vote. And there are two ideas that are circulating now in terms of what can happen, which are complex and contradictory. The first one, which was seen to some extent 4 years ago, is that there were 7 or 8, I don't remember exactly, maybe Professor Diamond can correct me if I'm wrong, but that didn't vote for Donald Trump in 2016. I believe that 1 or 2 of them voted for Colin Powell, and 2 or 3 more voted for another Republican, a distinguished Republican. But if I remember correctly, we're talking about the 6 or 7 who didn't vote. And there was a certain level of controversy as to whether they had the right to do it or not, if they had the right to vote, however they wanted. There are many people who are exerting pressure to so that they are given this freedom, and there's this legal debate as to whether they have that freedom or not. But the other mechanism to distort, if you will, the spirit of the Electoral College, the other mechanism that is being contemplated by some today, is that where state legislatures can give a mandate to their representatives so that they can vote otherwise. We're talking about the Alabama state legislature. Excuse me, Pennsylvania. They have a Republican majority. So the state legislature in Pennsylvania should give a mandate to their delegation to the Electoral College, giving the mandate not to vote for the winner of the popular vote in the state by them, but for Trump, because there was a fraud or there were ballots that arrived late, or you name it. I mean, simply based on the concept of the sovereignty of the state legislature in relation to the delegation sent to the Electoral College. We'll see if this happens. I find it difficult for political reasons. Why? Because this would be against what has happened in the last week, in the last 10 days after the election. But you cannot discard that, because I believe that there are some legal loopholes or gaps that would allow it. I would just like to conclude by sharing some brief thoughts on the perspectives of change when it comes to the Electoral College, considering everything what President Chinchill said and what I just shared with you. Constitutional reform seems difficult for many reasons. The last serious attempt to change reform the Electoral College took place in the late 60s, promoted by Senator Birch Bayh from Indiana, and it extended all the way to the mid-70s with the support of President Nixon, and President Ford, and even Governor Reagan from California. But it failed at the end for the same reasons. For which the Electoral College was created in the late 18th century as a result of the actions of segregationist senators, especially Strom Thurmond. This attempt went adrift, and there has been no other attempt ever since then, and it would seem difficult that we may see one soon. However, we have this initiative that may prosper, which is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, or NPVIC. I had to read it because I cannot memorize it. That's why I had to put on my glasses so I could read it. And this compact, this agreement that already has the state approval of more than 20 states, including California and New York, stipulates or establishes that each state or the delegation or their state delegation to the Electoral College would vote or could vote in favor of the winner of the popular vote, the national popular vote. That means that the delegation from Alabama, for example, would have to vote for Biden, regardless of the voting of or the votes of people in Alabama, or regardless of whether he won the electoral vote nationally or not. So given what I mentioned, in the sense that 7 out of the 8 last elections have been won by the Democrat candidates, when it comes to the popular votes, there will be a lot of resistance, but the NPBIC initiative has gained traction because it would not require a constitutional reform. And in fact, it would find a way around the Electoral College. In fact, it would suppress them because automatically delegates would have to vote the way the country voted. I mean, in practice, the second electoral round in the Electoral College would be suppressed. I know what the perspectives of success would be. I don't have the exact number of states, but once they reach a certain number, it would be enforced, and this may prosper. But it would face political challenges, the political challenges that we have mentioned already. Thank you, Councillor Humphrey. Thanks a lot, Dr. Castaneda. First of all, I believe that we're all eager to read this book that you already announced, which is published already. I also believe that it's important to consider this historic analysis, including the attempts to reform the Electoral College could be done after 10 years, and the new initiative that may be successful, considering that it doesn't require constitutional changes. And what Dr. Castaneda referred to as a dysfunctional democracy, which clearly needs adjustments. And that's why, in addition to thanking you for your participation, Dr. Castaneda, I would like to now give the floor to Dr. Larry Diamond.
Thank you, dear Larry, for being here with us. And the floor is
Good. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I have to speak in English rather than Spanish. But I want to begin, I hope the translators will translate this, by thanking the translators. They're just doing a remarkable job. It's one of the best I've experienced in these kinds of international conferences. Well, it's my honor to participate in this important seminar and to follow President Chinchill and Professor Castaneda. I have a great deal of respect for both of them. Let me say, professors and citizens of the United States had better approach these conversations with quite a good deal of humility because we are a flawed democracy. That is how The Economist magazine's Democracy Index classifies us now. And I think both in terms of our institutional functioning and the decay of what was an admirable democratic culture, both indicate that. Let me make the following observations. First of all, Joe Biden is going to be inaugurated President of the United States on January 20th. You should have absolutely no doubt of that. He is going to win the Electoral College on December 14th. You should have absolutely no doubt of that. And these schemes to violate the democratic will of the people beyond the violence that can already be done to that by the Electoral College, by essentially stealing the Electoral College through the mechanism which the US Constitution in theory allows of having state legislatures simply allocate the electors to whoever they want rather than the will of the people, they're not going to succeed, even though President Trump is clearly toying with them and toying with other undemocratic methods of staying in power. I think there are two reasons why they're not going to succeed. One you're familiar with and one you may not be familiar with. The one you're familiar with, as Jorge said, is that the election is actually not close. Joe Biden is going to win a popular vote margin of at least 6 million. It may wind up being 7 million. And while the percentage victory, is going to be probably only something like 4% margin, that is actually the biggest margin of defeat for an incumbent president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932. The second reason why this is not going to succeed is because a heroic and inspiring and nonpartisan and bipartisan network of civil society has spent months preparing for this. And it is a major reason why we didn't have an electoral catastrophe this year. I'm going to come back to that. But it's also a major reason why this theft of the Electoral College that Trump and his undemocratic companions and co-conspirators are not going to bring off. There's been a great deal of preparation quietly to work on this and try and neutralize this. I can't go into all the details now. And really to ensure that we stay on track democratically. So don't have any doubt about it. Democracy is going to hold in the United States this year. However, I am worried. Donald Trump's undermining of confidence in the electoral process from months in advance with his trashing without foundation of the process of mail-in voting, simply because he knew that it would favor Democrats, is unconscionable. And we're going to get out of this. We're going to get to electoral alternation on January 20th. But historians will look back and with a kind of chilling nervousness at how close the United States came to, I think, a breakdown of democracy in 2020. And this is why I say that we need to approach this as Norte Americanos with a great deal of humility. In terms of what Jorge was saying, unfortunately, we are stuck with the Electoral College. Because there is not going to be a constitutional amendment to eliminate it anytime soon because of the massive advantage it gives to the Republican Party. It's virtually the only way that this Republican Party can win now. The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact has been adopted by states and the District of Columbia with 196 electoral votes. Nevada is probably going to adopt it. That'll be 202. But it's going to be really difficult to get to 270 because a lot of the other states in the Biden coalition have Republican state legislatures. They're not going to vote for it. Unfortunately, with the Republicans having won regain control of these state legislatures, and they're now going to, with the decennial census, embark on redistricting. The same gerrymandering that has disfigured and disgraced our electoral process in the United States for many decades is going to happen again. The one positive thing I can say is it's going to happen in fewer states than has happened previously because many states have adopted reforms to eliminate partisan gerrymandering of electoral districts. So we will begin to see in more states, as we have seen in California, the transition to nonpartisan commissions to redraw district boundaries after the 2020 census. Even to some extent in Republican states like Ohio, the voters have adopted voter initiatives to do this. And this underscores a different element of the decentralized federal system in the US. Yes, it's a mess. Yes, I regret our absence of standardized National Electoral Administration. I wish we had something like the National Electoral Institute in the United States, or the system of National Electoral Administration in an even larger federation in India. But the fact is, we are making progress at the state level as a result of citizen mobilization at the grassroots to improve democracy, to eliminate gerrymandering. The state of Oregon just adopted, you can look it up, Measure 107, a campaign finance reform that's very far-reaching. We're starting to get creative finance, campaign finance reform at the state level. There are other things we can do by legislation that don't require a constitutional amendment. Unfortunately, I don't think the disgraceful decision of the United States Supreme Court in Citizens United equating campaign spending with free speech is going to be changed anytime soon, because of how much more conservative the Supreme Court is now than it was even then. But that decision legally, I think, still does allow closer scrutiny of super PACs, better enforcement of the requirement that they be independent of political campaigns, which has become a joke in the United States now, and the elimination at least of dark money so that we have radical transparency. I've written a piece with my colleague at Ohio State, who's one of the gurus on election law, Ned Foley, on the tragedy we might have seen, but I think are going to avert with the Electoral College. The dispute mechanisms are deeply flawed. Some of them reside in the Electoral Count Act of 1887. And of course, that's a piece of legislation. We can reform that, and I think we must. Let me talk about some good news. The election was amazingly well run. As you know, it was probably the most smoothly administered election in recent US national history. And I think that there were some reasons for that we can identify. One, ironically, was COVID. Because of COVID, many, many more people voted in advance. They voted by mail and they engaged in early voting. And because of COVID, the states allowed wider mail-in voting and greater voting by mail in advance. People love it. There's going to be no going back to the restraints on voting that we had before. And this business that the governor of Texas, this sordid business he was involved in, to remove the drop boxes for the early voting or mail-in voting process, so that the county of Harris surrounding Houston only had one drop box for more than 4 million people. I think they're going to be under growing pressure to abandon these types of actions that suppress the vote. I think another reason why the election was so well run, no thanks to the US Congress, which didn't appropriate enough money to assist the states and localities, is that civil society really stepped up to the occasion here and performed, I think, in heroic terms that will require very close documentation by journalists and scholars in the months and years to come. They did a lot of work to work with the states and localities. There was a massive effort by my colleague at Stanford, the law professor Nate Persily, who you should engage at some point, who set up something with Charles Stewart, the political scientist at MIT, called the Healthy Elections Project. And this project, you can Google it, this project tracked laws and regulations in the different states, worked to identify problems and try and upgrade them, and cooperated with a network of other civil society organizations to recruit an enormous volume of new electoral workers to staff the polls on election day, given that many of the usual elderly poll workers didn't want to work because of COVID-19. And the other thing is that American foundations channeled hundreds of millions of dollars into support for state and local electoral administration to help them modernize their techniques and their voting machines when the United States Congress didn't appropriate adequate money because of course, the Republicans weren't interested in having this. So I think they need to be applauded for what they did. And as a result, the new machines worked better. The recount that's going to happen in Georgia now is going to happen because for the first time in Georgia, the machines left an auditable paper trail, and that's what's going to be recounted. So this is an amazing thing. And as a result of all this, ironically, nobody expected this. We had the highest voter turnout in the United States in 120 years. 2/3 of Americans voted in this election. So all of this worked. I want to conclude by saying we need reform. Thank you for my two colleagues who preceded me in noting this, both to further improve our system of electoral administration, to end the scourge of voter suppression, to try at least the mechanism of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact to neutralize the Electoral College, and also to change our electoral system, which has all sorts of incentives to polarization that are very destructive. I favor ranked choice voting, whether in single-member districts or multi-member districts with proportional representation, as the best mechanism for doing that. We could talk about that. The state of Maine, by voter initiative, adopted that in 2016 and 2018. Unfortunately, this is one of the great misfortunes of the 2018 election. There were two more voter initiatives on the ballot to adopt ranked choice voting this year in Massachusetts and Alaska, and they both lost. But the cause continues, and we're going to keep working on this. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Larry Diamond. And I want to say a few things. I'm going to do it in Spanish, but it's very interesting to hear from you, from your side, your point of view, and from someone from the United States about your elections, about the process, about the reforms that you need, and it's an honor to have you here. Particularmente, me parece muy interesante.
Particularly, I believe that everything that Dr. Diamond said, I believe that it was interesting to hear everything he said, because I believe that this makes it very clear. In addition to being different electoral systems, we can all reach this breaking point. As a matter of fact, some of the previous panelists talk about the re-election and how public resources were used for re-election purposes, like in Mexico. In Mexico, we're in the middle of this process. This is the first time we will have re-elections in the Chamber of Deputies and Senators. And we have this debate, can they use public resources, which is not legal in Mexico? I mean, should they take a leave before getting reelected? So we're in the middle of this heavy debate. Many of the things that Professor Diamond mentioned make a lot of sense to us. First, it is also clear that it was interesting to hear that Biden will take office in January. He also talked about this difference of 7 million votes margin, but also this 4% difference, which is the biggest percentage when it comes to this type of elections ever since Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as he mentioned. I also find it interesting to hear about these efforts that are being made in different states, because we're kind of in a similar situation. In Mexico, we have seen achievements in several states in different areas like gender parity, for example, indigenous or native peoples and communities, and electronic voting, of which I am a great supporter. I believe that we should try to maximize or expand the choices of voting for electors. We don't have early voting, but we're beginning to use machines and online voting, which is now available to many Mexicans living abroad. So I believe it's interesting to hear what they are doing locally. And something that electoral counselors are interested in is the following. The use of resources, financial resources, how to make these resources transparent, how to make sure that we know who they come from and the amounts, which is a challenge in Mexico, a major challenge in Mexico. Together with this, we also need international cooperation efforts because these flows of money are not limited to our boundaries. Oftentimes, these resources come from other countries. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Diamond. And without further to say, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Emilio Rabasa, who is also a scholar and a researcher of the National University, but he was also a Mexican ambassador to the OAS. He was a consul in Boston. Thank you, Dr. Rabasa. Thank you, Councillor Humphrey. Thank you. Thank you to the Dean of the School of Law of the National University, and also Lorenzo Cordova. And thank you to Manuel Carrillo, who insisted a lot on my participating here. It's an honor to be able to share this panel, this discussion panel with my two big friends, great friends, Dr. Chinchill and Dr. Castaneda. And for the first time, I'm honored to have this stage together with Dr. Diamond, whom I met as a result of my thesis at Cambridge. When I read his Introduction to Politics and Society that he wrote together with Linz. It's an honor to share this table with them. I will divide my presentation into the following parts, two parts actually. One first part that has to do with the elections themselves and the results. And then at the end, I will talk about this issue about the judicialization of elections that we're witnessing, that I was asked to address. As regards my first segment, the starting point has to do with some of the things mentioned by Laura Chinchilla. In general terms, in Latin America, we were used to seeing stability in elections in the US, and we compared it usually against the instability of our electoral processes for reasons that we all know. But now we have the opposite situation. The roles were reversed. Now we are witnessing a deeply unstable election, even long before it happened on November the 3rd, even though at the same time we had more stable elections in Latin America. We were used to this traditional system that involved the primary elections. Then you had the nomination of a candidate, the convention, you had campaigns, debates, and finally voting, and then TV networks based on the figures provided by vote counting centers, they did their projections, and by that same night, they always had a winner. And something important that is not in writing, but is practice in US elections is what we call conceding. I mean, these conceding speeches where the losing candidate concedes the very same night of the election. Then you had the transition period, and ceremony for the new president. Very few people paid attention to what happened in the Electoral College. We began seeing some complications that was mentioned by some of my previous colleagues in the election in 2000, which we had the Bush-Gore conflict that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And then with Clinton, we had a failure of polls and the emergence of the candidacy of Donald Trump finally with bellicist narrative, kind of a war narrative that we hadn't heard before, where Mexicans played a key role because we were initially called rapists and criminals with a vicious attack on NAFTA, among other things. We're talking about the election that Trump won with 3 million popular votes. That was the history. That was the background history. But what happened now? Recently, I published an article in El Universal featuring a hypothesis where I say that in order to understand this election, we need to cross two coordinates. On one hand, and this has been said by my previous friends, we're talking about an electoral system that is outdated, rusty, with indirect voting. An electoral system that has double counting. I mean, you have the electoral vote and popular vote. An electoral system that is even more complex, considering three factors. Number one, only two states, Maine and Nebraska, accept the distribution of voters based on popular voting proportionally. Only these two states. The others follow the rule of the winner takes all. As the ABBA song says. I mean, even if, with just one vote difference, whoever won that vote will take all the electors, all the voters, or all the votes. Number two, we have a significant disparity when it comes to the number of voters. In California, we have 55, Texas 33, compared to Vermont or Delaware in DC with 3 electors. But the third level of complexity, which is something that was well covered by Jorge Castaneda, has to do with this commitment of voting in the Electoral College. I found this article entitled The Green Papers that says that in 24 states, there is no commitment to vote based on the result of popular voting. They don't have that commitment. And in 26 states, they do have the commitment by law, subject to penalties if they do not vote in the direction of the popular vote. That gives you an idea of the complexity of their electoral system, which has been fairly criticized, I believe. I also share the idea of the need to reform it, either moving towards the popular system, which I find very difficult, or at least to follow the example of Maine and Nebraska so that there is a different distribution of electoral votes proportionally based on the popular vote. The other coordinate given this system, which was designed especially for other types of circumstances, is this deep divide in the US society. That's something that is not exclusive to the US, but it is exacerbated in the US. we're talking about the level of polarization that was exacerbated by President Trump himself. Even though we already had a certain level of divide or polarization, but it was only reinforced as a result of the emergence of this white nationalism that dates back to the 19th century and was born in Massachusetts with the creation of the anti-immigrant law promoted by some Harvard graduates. We're talking about the level of polarization where we had clearly two narratives. One was in favor of protectionism pushed by Trump against migrants, against a series of rights related to gender and based on a literal interpretation of the Constitution, versus another narrative in favor of globalization, market openness, and going back to the Paris Accords to protect the environment, as well as going back to WHO, and in favor of gender rights and based on a constitutional interpretation that would favor the most marginalized sectors promoted by Mrs. Ruth Greenberg. This was amid the existence of a highly decentralized system, as mentioned by Mrs. Chinchill, where you can also see differences based on your belonging to social groups, which is something that Jorge Castaneda highlighted, but also with the presence of urban, suburban, and rural votes, rural in favor of Trump and urban and suburban in favor of Biden. All of this was compounded by a pandemic that is hitting the US hard, even harder than it's hitting Europe. You have 10.4 million people infected, more than 240,000 people dead. And the number keeps on growing. And as Larry Diamond said, paradoxically, this pandemic favored higher turnout as a result of early or postal voting, which allowed them to set records when it comes to voting. Polls, unlike the situation with Hillary Clinton, pointed towards a winner, Biden, but not with this blue tsunami that some people expected. However, there was a difference of 5 million votes and many seats in the Electoral College, which means that, in my opinion, we will have 306 in favor of Biden. That's a significant difference. Now, what are we seeing right now? What we are seeing right now are elections, where one of the main political actors, the president, is refusing to accept the election results. He's filing lawsuits in many states. He disagrees with electoral results, and he refuses to concede in favor of Biden, which is a disruption of the electoral process, or as Larry Diamond said, a democratic breaking point that will have deep impacts in their system. I mean, he was trying to discredit, to slander a system that didn't give him the victory. Just because he's not willing to admit his defeat. Mitt Romney said it clearly on an interview in CNN. He said that Donald Trump is refusing to admit he lost because it's not in his nature to admit it. That's the clear profile of an autocratic populism that is incapable of understand that in democracy you sometimes win and you sometimes lose. So we're in front of a situation. I wouldn't call it conflictive. I wouldn't say it's a real conflict. And I'm glad to hear these comments by Larry Diamond when he talked about civil society efforts and these watchful activities or actions by them. And I say it because that was unheard of in post-electoral settings. So that was interesting. And now let me go to the next part of my presentation, which has to do with the judicialization of elections. This accusation by President Trump in the sense that he had won the elections and that the Democrats stole it from him through this massive fraud is ridiculous. What are the steps in the US judicial system from the standpoint of getting all the way to the Supreme Court? Well, first you need to prove before state courts that there were irregularities, as mentioned by President Chinchill. They do not have a justice system like the one in Mexico, because in Mexico we have an electoral tribunal. In the US, courts themselves process these matters. The result must be challenged before a state court so that state judges can order a recount of the votes. Number two, you have the intervention of federal courts in states. And as a final resort, like in Florida, the Supreme Court of Justice would intervene, where we know there is a predominant conservative composition, especially with recent designations by Mr. Trump. Oh, and by the way, in a judicial system, we're talking about a judicial system that literally invented the due process of law. We're talking about a system where you need to substantiate your claims and provide or submit real evidence. This has happened in Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, and Georgia. I'm not going to get into the details of all this process. I won't get into the details as to what type of lawsuits were filed in each of these states, because they have all been different. But let me cite the example of Pennsylvania, which I believe that would illustrate this problem of judicialization. In Pennsylvania, they claimed that there was an obstruction by electoral observers, including the distance at which they should stand in relation to electoral officers counting votes. First, they had determined the distance should be the equivalent of 6 meters, and then Republicans and Giuliani insisted on keeping a distance of 2 meters. They finally agreed on this distance, especially considering the current health crisis. They also insisted on not receiving or not counting votes received by mail after November the 3rd. In the case of Pennsylvania, we're talking about some 10,000 votes, a state where Biden has a difference of more than 50,000 votes in his favor. Number third, the proof of identity to clarify the situation of postal voting, which is something surprising to us, because they made the decision to call citizens at their homes to tell them, hey, we have a vote from you, but we need a clarification regarding your address or your signature. And on TV, we saw long lines of citizens to clarify the status of their vote because they wanted their votes to count. We're talking about the proof of identity process, which was surprising. Number four, stop the certification of results, so that the certification was issued only once a resolution was issued in connection with these challenges. Well, what are the possibilities of them succeeding in this regard? Well, their possibilities are limited because in some states, these claims have been rejected, like this claim about distance keeping. has been discarded or dismissed. They don't have sufficient evidence to prove of their claims, but even if they had the evidence, that evidence, like in Florida, that evidence should be enough to make a real difference in electoral results, because a few votes won't be enough for the courts to proceed. For example, yesterday, we saw this transcript on CNN regarding something said the judge when he was questioning an attorney, and he was telling the attorney, and by the way, under oath of telling the truth, they have to make a statement. They can be accused of perjury if they lie. And the judge told this attorney, in these 500 something votes, did you find any evidence of fraud? Look at the high level of thoroughness in these processes. The Republican attorneys said, no, I don't have evidence, which means that Trump's campaign is playing with this bluffing authority. I mean, publicly they say that there was a fraud. But if they have to appear before a court under oath and under penalty of perjury, they have to tell the truth. And in these transcripts released by CNN, repeatedly, judges asked, in this certain number of votes, did you or anybody in your political party find clear evidence of fraud? The answer was always no. So, publicly speaking, they have an attitude. When they're before a court, they have a different attitude. I don't believe that we'll see once again the situation we had in Florida a while ago, because at least we have 5 states in this situation. But I don't believe that this strategy of judicializing the electoral process will succeed. A process promoted by a candidate that doesn't want to concede or accept his defeat. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rabasa. I believe that you conducted an interesting analysis, including the conditions that demand an urgent reform in the electoral system, and this judicialization process that has limited possibilities of succeeding. And something else important you mentioned is the differences between state legislations, which is something that always draws a lot of attention in Mexico because we have a different system. So I believe that you mentioned many interesting topics. I would like to make a couple of comments before we start with a round of questions and answers that we already have for many of you. I would like to stress what Professor Diamond said, because elections in Mexico, in my opinion, have 2 essential pillars now. One is that we will be holding them in the middle of the pandemic. And this example that he gave us as to how elections were organized in the US amid the pandemic, but also considering the participation of civil society is important. We just held a couple of elections where we had very clear rules regarding health measures to limit the number of COVID infections, which is key. So everything he said is interesting. So I believe that it's important to share these experiences locally, because obviously this will be a core issue for INE in these upcoming elections, health measures. And the other aspect, which is something that we have been working on, and that's why I'm making this comment, is that we will have a woman as the first vice president in the US, based on assessments in Mexico and reforms to have parity in different government positions is interesting and important. And I'm being asked to read the questions So that if you want, you can answer them in the order in which you presented. The first question for everyone is this: even though there have been initiatives to change the electoral system in the US, what's still missing? What's still necessary to materialize these changes? Another question is, in addition to reforms to the presidential elections, do you believe that the changes are necessary in the legislative so that representation is better and fight gerrymandering? Would you have to start talking about proportionality in the chambers in the US? For Dr. Castaneda, don't you believe that the NBIC project is not consistent with the electoral system? It's a partial exit to the problem of the lack of political willingness to make a constitutional reform. But don't you believe that the adoption of the NBIC initiative only in some state legislature would create split when it comes to making decisions in the electoral college? I believe we can start with these three questions. I don't know if President Chinchill wants to start with some comments to these questions, and then we'll follow with the next speakers. I would prefer to pass on this because there are other presenters that know a lot more about this potential or need for these changes in the US. Dr. Castaneda? I'll address the question that was asked directly to me. As far as I understand, for the NBIC initiative to be adopted, it should be approved by states whose number of delegates in the Electoral College exceed 270. That is 50% plus one of the 538. And once it was adopted by those states, it would be implemented automatically, I believe. It would be applied to all of them, or in any event, to one half, and the other half would continue to operate the way it has operated. I do not believe that this initiative is inconsistent with the federalism system, or that it will create a split. However, I believe that it is not easy to achieve because, as Larry Diamond said, I don't remember exactly how he said it, but considering the weight of Republicans in these small states, I mean, it would be difficult to achieve these 270 votes necessary considering their weight. But it may be possible, I don't know. But if it succeeded, it would be a major step. And I don't believe that the risks of breaking with the federalism would be significant. Thank you. Yes, go ahead, Professor Diamond.
Okay, well, I'm actually looking at a map right now of where the National Popular Vote Compact stands in the US. I can send you the link to it, or you can just Google nationalpopularvote.com state status. But, you know, it's just going to be really hard to get to 270 because of Republican control of so many state legislatures. There's a chance in Virginia, there's a chance in, I think, you know, there's a chance in Minnesota, maybe in Arizona eventually someday, but to get to 270 with the, I don't see it happening in the next 10 years. I also want to say, keep in mind, we have the most conservative Supreme Court now that we've had in at least 2 or 3 generations. And there are some questions about the constitutionality of the National Popular Vote Compact. I think we should do it anyway, but I do fear that if we ever got to this and then it was sent to this Supreme Court with the election hanging in the balance, I don't know what would happen. So of course, we have two reform challenges before us. One has to do with the system of electoral administration, and the other has to do with the electoral system in terms of translating votes into seats. With the respect to the first, you've all said it so well and so accurately. You know, we're radically decentralized. That's going to be hard to change. But I do think it is conceivable and consistent with the US Constitution to have stronger federal standards that the states have to adopt. For example, in the counting of mail-in ballots. Now, you know, there's an interesting and very clever idea that's circulating right now. The Constitution gives states pretty radical discretion over managing the presidential election, but it doesn't give them radical discretion over the congressional election. And Congress has much more ability to set standards for congressional elections. And once it does that, it's basically fixed the problem, because states aren't going to have two elections, one for president and one for Congress. So I think we could require, for example, nationally, that mail-in ballots be counted, opened and counted in advance as they're received. And, you know, Florida counted its vote on election night, and Florida's got more votes than Pennsylvania because they allowed for the pre-canvassing and pre-counting of the mail-in ballots. So this is a reform people will be looking at. Now, it's very interesting that a questioner has raised better representation and, of course, proportionality. A bill has actually been introduced in the United States Congress. It's called the Fair Representation Act, introduced by Congressman Don Byers, to break up all states that have 6 or more members of Congress into multi-member districts between 3 and 5 members, and then use proportional representation to select those members. You could even add on ranked choice voting, and you'd have the single transferable vote as in Ireland. I think interest is growing in PR and moderate multi-member districts, moderately sized districts. Of course, it's a long time from now before it's going to be adopted nationally. What we would need to do this at the congressional level is congressional enabling legislation, because the Congress ruled out multi-member districts for Congress in the 1960s because it didn't want southern states to use multi-member districts without PR to ensure continued white supremacy. States have had PR in the past and could do it again for their state legislatures. They wouldn't need federal approval. But anyway, it's like everything else. We just, civil society organizes, and we just keep working on this.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rabasa, por favor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rabasa. Let me address the first question as to what's still missing to reform the electoral system in the US. Well, I believe that we necessarily have to do the following. Number one, we need to hit rock bottom with the crisis. Let's remember that we began reforming our system once the political system in Mexico had hit rock bottom with the crisis of 1968. Years after that, we began to implement these political electoral reforms that helped us transition from an authoritarian single-party hegemonic party to a democracy, as defined by Sartori. These elections, in my opinion, could be the elections that could represent the rock bottom for the electoral system. Number two, we need a bipartisan agreement. I mean, we need to have, or we need to get the Republicans and Democrats to sit at the same table so that they can together find the formula that is much more equal, more fair, to avoid this type of deep controversies, because no reform will pass if it favors the voters of a political party or a political party compared to all the others. So, but I also see a good opportunity with the arrival of a man like Joe Biden, who, beginning with his initial discourse, made a call to unity. He made a call to avoid this difference between red and blue states. He has a lot of experience in the Senate. He was a senator for many years, and then he was a vice president. And water begins to become more stable after all this storm of the demonization pushed by Trump. He could encourage political parties to reach an agreement on this reform, which may be gradual, like in Mexico. First, we're talking about the distribution of electoral votes proportionally compared to a popular vote. That would be one initial step. And the second thing is what Dr. Diamond just mentioned. When it comes to the counting, to vote counting, early and postal voting should be counted even before election day, so that by the day of election, all they have to do is count in-person votes. Thank you, Dr. Rabasa.
20 more questions that I'm going to read. La primera para el Dr. Rabasa.
The first one is for Dr. Rabasa. What measures can the U.S. take to strengthen its electoral system and democratic system that can also be used in Latin America? And then a general question. What will be the political or social impact of the U.S. election for Latin America? What will be the impact of the U.S. elections on Latin America? And then a question for Dr. Chinchilla. One person says, the audience includes members of several electoral bodies in Latin America. What are the main points that we should consider for our purposes of our electoral systems, considering what just happened in the U.S.? We have to take care of our institutions. We need to strengthen our electoral bodies. But to do that, what can we do? Thank you for your answer. President Chinchilla? Yes, thank you. Let me start with the second question. Let me just answer two of them. Look, I would like to congratulate the INE and all the organizers of this event and all of those that participate in elections, because we're talking about the foundational moment for democracies. Everything having to do with the electoral processes is important. So if you're part of an electoral body, you're important. I've always believed that the most important value in electoral officers is their independence of criteria, which I'm sure you have. And obviously, you need to continue to become more and more professional when it comes to processes, including new techniques, guaranteeing or protecting integrity of voters, and guaranteeing or ensuring voters to polling stations. But we also have risks. But these risks do not necessarily have to do with you or with the electoral process. We're living moments where, paradoxically, we're seeing leaders that take power thanks to the democracy of electoral processes. But some leaders deteriorate the powers, and they attack the rights for political participation and freedom of speech. And that's what also weakens the autonomy of electoral bodies, but especially confidence. That undermines confidence. I believe that when it comes to confidence, we're seeing many expressions today, but I believe that big efforts must be made by electoral bodies so that you can communicate with citizens. The case of the US shows that the value of confidence was important, and that a well-organized civil society, a well-mobilized civil society with civic values is important. And I believe that in this case, we need to work in partnership with other sectors of civil society with strong convictions in favor of democracy, as well as the education sectors, so that we can make up for the messages that this type of leaders will continue to plant in the minds of people, leading them to distrust electoral bodies. And as regards the impact of U.S. elections on Latin American countries and our elections, well, considering the situation, I must confess that I'm still optimistic despite the situation in the U.S., which will be affected not only as a result of internal situations, but also because of political issues. Mr. Biden has been in a region several times. He has been close to issues in Central America and Mexico. There is a very solid proposal that we have already studied. And I believe that we could have an agenda based on more humanistic and democratic values. I believe that we have a possibility of seeing a more consistent policy with more fair solutions to issues in the US, like migration, security, and aspects such as those in Nicaragua and Venezuela regarding democracy. However, based on these values, and with this minimum consistency, we would achieve better results, because what we had so far were just some outbursts in reaction to circumstances. Thank you, former President Chinchill, Dr. Castaneda. Well, let me just go back to the issue of the Senate and proportional representation. This may be the most difficult challenge, and at the same time, the most important aspect. For example, just to give you an example that many of you know, a constitutional reform in the US must be approved by 3/5 of states, if I remember correctly. The amendment of the Equal Rights Amendment, 3/4, yeah. You're right, 3/4, you're right. That's even worse. This act was submitted in 1921 or 1922. It hasn't been approved yet. Nebraska, if I remember correctly, just approved, ratified this bill. And pending the solution of a technical issue, it may already be approved. But we're talking about 100 years, almost 100 years in the making. Why? Because a bunch of states, 1/4 of the states, that is 13 states, have a veto right. They can veto constitutional reforms, any constitutional reforms. And that applies to the Senate, where 12, 13 states, or maybe a little more, with small populations like Wyoming, have a virtual right of veto. They can veto decisions with states like California or New York in favor. That's not the case of Texas yet. But if Florida and Texas became blue states, which is not impossible, it may happen in 2, 4, or 6 years. It's not impossible. Florida already voted for Democratic candidates in the past, like Obama. So if we imagine this situation, we would have the same representation, California, New York, Texas, and Florida, that would add up to more than 100 million people. And they would have the same Senate votes than Wyoming, Montana, etc. So it's kind of an aberration. They should make an effort to change this part of the foundational pact of the 13 colonies and enslaving states in favor of slavery. The weight of the original sin of slavery goes beyond the issue of African American populations, even though that's the most horrendous aspect, but it goes beyond the issue of African American populations. It involves a series of elements that have to do with this foundational pact that have not been, they haven't been able to change in more than 200 years of existence, and which, in my opinion, are leading to this dysfunctional democracy. Thank you, Dr. Castaneda. I would like to take advantage to make a question or read a question for Dr. Diamond. He said they have a question for him. Can you briefly refer to the role played by the media in this electoral process? So you may want to answer the rest of the questions, and if not, at least if you can answer this question for you.
Right. Well, amazingly, the media was pretty responsible at the end. It was stunning. You know, one of the things that civil society organizations, these nonpartisan networks, did was work at length with the media and the public to educate them to the fact that we weren't going to have a result very probably on election night, and that they had to exercise restraint in calling the election and make people aware of the fact that there was nothing wrong. It was just going to take time to count the mail-in ballots, and they wanted to be responsible. And, you know, to my amazement, obviously the media outlet, which is a very, very influential one that I was most worried about, was Fox News. And Trump is really mad at Fox News now because they've been pretty responsible in waiting to call the election, then calling it and not allowing, you know, and not giving much credence, some, but not much, to these charges of election fraud. So I think this has been an element of progress. I'm going to have to go now to another event that I have, but I wanted to say two things in conclusion. One is that I personally, as a scholar and democracy activist, am trying to focus on reforms that don't require a constitutional amendment, because I don't think we're going to get, in this fraught, polarized, partisan environment, constitutional amendments that might affect the partisan balance anytime soon. There is a way to make the Senate less unrepresentative than it now is without a constitutional amendment that could happen by legislation. And that would be to grant statehood to Puerto Rico and to make DC a kind of state with 2 senators and a member of Congress. And I believe that if Democrats ever have unified control of government, they will do those 2 things. And the second thing I just wanted to say is to thank the National Electoral Institute and all of you. I've learned a lot about the US even by listening to all of you. And as I say, I think this notion that, well, there were the advanced democracies, there are the emerging democracies, we have all sorts of gifts and wisdom to bestow upon you, that's dead. What we now have is democracies that are struggling with their historic flaws, the curse of populism, the intolerance and the threats to a civic culture that President Chinchill was eloquently addressing. And we just all have to work together to learn from one another and strategize with one another. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much, Professor Diamond. It's been a pleasure and honor, and thanks for being with us.
Okay, bye-bye.
Doctor Rabasa, si quiere atender.
Dr. Rabasa, would you like to answer the last question before we close the event? Because We're beyond schedule. Thank you, Councillor. Let me talk about the one specifically asked to me as to what to do to strengthen democracy in the US and in Latin America. There are no recipes, of course, but I do believe that any institutional achievement in terms of strengthening has to go through three elements. Number one, civil society. We need to remember that transition into democracy in authoritarian systems in the last quarter of the last century, to a large extent, were possible thanks to the participation of civil society and the organization efforts of what we know as grassroots organizations. Dr. David Lehman published this book, Democracy and Development in Latin America, where he talks about these grassroots efforts, which contributed to changes in authoritarianism and democracy in Eastern Europe with the so-called forms like solidarity in Poland. So the exercise of rights, political rights and democratic rights in the sphere of civil society is important. The second aspect has to do with the media. The media must be impartial. They must be watchful. We also saw something unheard of in these recent elections in the US, which I never imagined we would see. We saw TV networks interrupting a speech from the US president because he was already talking about fraud, and that was considered fake news. This led to a debate as to whether the media should have this power or not. But what is important is the role played by the media. And also, as mentioned by Mr. Diamond, they worked on telling people or informing people why these results were taking so long. And the third way is the institutional way. Of course, you cannot strengthen a democracy if you don't strengthen democratic institutions. We learned it thanks to 6 or 7 electoral reforms. Our democratization process was gradual. We didn't have a Moncloa pact like in Spain. I mean, every country can choose its route, but the focus should be on institutions so that they can be strengthened and to prevent this corrosive effect of populism, which is a deeply anti-democratic and authoritarian attitude to continue from mining or undermining democracies. Thank you, Dr. Rabasa. Without further to say, I just want to close this event. Thank you all for your participation. Of course, I want to thank Dr. Contreras and the president of the INE, Lorenzo Cordova, the former president, Laura Chinchill, who just wrote in the chat that she has to leave. Thanks to Dr. Diamond and thanks to Dr. Rabasa, of course. Thank you to Manuel Carrillo for organizing this event, and I'm sure we'll see each other again as part of this series of discussions. Thank you.